I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are formerly of Velocities and Music, but this is our podcast.
Yes.
Not album reviews done in video, but topics in music discussed via audio.
Right.
Tom, today, I'm going to throw a random subject at you, and I want to just dive in. Are you ready?
I'm ready to dive. I got my swimsuit on and everything.
It's good looking, too.
All right.
All right.
It's a Speedo.
All right. Led Zeppelin.
Ooh.
Probably my favorite hard rock band of all time.
Okay.
Led Zeppelin was the band that, when I was really into Chumbawamba and Savage Garden in like 1997,
Yep.
listening to Star 104.5 in Western Iowa, I was this stupid 90s kid with a bowl cut that really loved pop music. And my dad said, "You are not my son unless you love Led Zeppelin." And he put on Led Zeppelin 4 on a car ride and forced me to listen to all of Zeppelin's discography, and it was the best moment of my life.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Led Zeppelin today, Tom.
That
I want
sounds
to talk
great.
about who Led Zeppelin was and is, what sort of music they wrote, and how their albums impacted the world of music today.
Wow. What a topic.
Do you think you can run with that?
Let's run with it.
Do you think you can run with that? First of all, what do you know about Led Zeppelin? I realize, so in fairness to Tom's musical knowledge is something I've always been insanely jealous of. In Velocities and Music Days, I refer to Tom all the time as our music historian, and he always scoffed at that, but the guy really does know a ton about music, and I'm putting him on the spot here, so he might not be fully ready, but I'm sure I'm going to be blown away by half the things,
that's
probably
true.
more than half the things you're going to say.
And
here.
honestly, when it comes to their history, I am a little bit sparse on that, admittedly. I know their music very well, and I'm a huge fan of all their music, really. But when it comes down to, I think one thing that's important to note right off the bat that a lot of people don't really realize is that they were a supergroup. Really, they were kind of one of the early rock supergroups. Now, of course, in the 60s, there were a lot of bands that had, rotating lineups and people who would go jump to other bands and whatnot. I mean, you look at Neil Young and all the stuff he was involved in, Buffalo Springfield.
Eric Clapton.
Right. Oh, Eric Clapton is a perfect example. He was in so many acts, working with so many different people at a time. But I think that was just kind of the atmosphere. And of course, as much as I can imagine what it was like without ever having been there, because it was a significant amount of time before I was born, from the music that I've listened to, from what I've seen that the acts were involved in, it was a very collaborative era.
Sure.
So, the idea of a super group, even at that time, is kind of hard to pin down. I mean, you could probably just as much call Cream a super group. Like you mentioned with Eric Clapton, he'd worked with other artists before then as well. But, more notably, Jimmy Page had worked with the Yardbirds. He had already established him as a solid guitarist. He had a reputation. But of course, it's one of those cases where, those four members converged, formed Led Zeppelin. And really, instead of Led Zeppelin being that band with the guy from the Yardbirds became that band with the guy from Led Zeppelin. At that point, the chronology doesn't really matter as much as which artist makes the most impact. Mm-hmm. And I think undeniably for Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, Robert Plant, and John Bonham, Led Zeppelin was the band that allowed the four of them to make the most impressive and lasting mark on music. So while you can find some other projects that they had been involved in and whatnot, I mean, that is what they're known for.
Right. They really defined hard rock,
right?
Where Black Sabbath may be the band who invented metal music,
right? And that's a whole argument in itself.
We could talk for 20 minutes just based
right.
on that assertion. But I do feel like Led Zeppelin really shocked the world when their sound hit the stage. Their first self-titled record, which came out in 1969. Mm-hmm. I've seen videos of some of those early cuts, them playing for small crowds, which
right.
didn't happen for very long. And Jimmy Page is playing his guitar with a bow, which is super awesome. Like the kid inside me just thinks, oh my gosh, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen, still to this day. And to think about where they took music and what they did with their certain amalgamation of styles of heavy rock, and what they did with that is something that I think begs to be discussed and dove into.
Right. And the the just monolithic popularity that they achieved, the success that they had, and what they were able to do, it's almost suspicious. It sounds like some record label manufactured pop success story, like it was all just a gimmick and it was planned ahead of time or something. But you make a good point in mentioning that, some of their early shows, it was still to small crowds. There was really nothing contrived or gimmicky about it. It was just four of the people who are not only the best at their instruments, but just amazing songwriters. And from that standpoint, I mean, there are a lot of people out there who think Led Zeppelin is very overrated, and I can maybe see where they're coming from.
Why would they say that?
Just because they're like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. They're one of those bands that you just can't avoid. You always hear about them.
And it's funny because they get compared to that often now. But back in the early 70s and the late 60s, when that comparison started getting thrown around, it was hearsay at that point. And now it's so obvious. But back then it was completely hearsay.
Yeah.
It was unthinkable. How could this band be as big as the Beatles or as musically dominant as the Beatles?
Right. Well, that's it is about timing as well, because Led Zeppelin started, their first two albums came out in 1969, which is of course when the year that Abbey Road came out. That was, the Beatles' last studio effort. So they were kind of already on their way out, but they had the previous 6 or 7 years of just complete dominance. And the Rolling Stones were following a similar path, but in a slightly divergent genre. I mean, they were both kind of, big they were big everywhere, but of course for Britain, having both of those acts come from there.
Well, one of the Stones' greatest albums came out in '69, Let It Bleed.
Right. And that also, though, is a time when they were very much shifting sounds, because that was right around the time that Brian Jones left the band. Let It Bleed was a much more kind of country and blues influenced album, as opposed to, and they were kind of starting to go in that direction with Beggar's Banquet prior to it, but they started rocking a little bit more in the early 70s with records like Exile on Main Street and Sticky Fingers. But even those two, while they were more rockin', they were very blues heavy. And sorry, not to get on a whole other conversation about the Rolling Stones, but it is important the context in which Led Zeppelin started rising to popularity, and what else was going on at the time, specifically in Britain, because, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones had really established themselves. But I think one thing that makes Led Zeppelin distinctly different from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and in this regard, more like the who came before them, and were also contemporaries of the time, and even like Rush is another band I'd put in this category, but every single one of them was an absolute master at what they did.
Yes.
John Bonham is one of the best drummers of all time.
Period.
Jimmy Page, obvious choice for one of the best guitarists of all time. Robert Plant's vocals were absolute perfection. And then, in my opinion, the most overlooked member of Led Zeppelin, John Paul Jones.
As a bassist, I can understand how you would say.
And I am a bass player. That's a good that you point out that I am coming at it with that perspective. But man, you listen to tracks like Song Remains the Same and the Lemon Song, and John Paul Jones is just holding it down. Not to mention on their more kind of psychedelic numbers like No Quarter, anything that involves that synth. He also busted out the mandolin for some tracks. And I mean, the guy was all over the place. He's kind of the sleeping giant of the band.
And he certainly, I feel like, as far as history is concerned, he really didn't come out of his shell musically until, Zeppelin 3 and 4, and then really was dominant in
Physical Graffiti, House of
the Holy, and some of the later records.
I totally agree.
The first 6 Zeppelin albums, Zeppelin 1, you have this very raw, energetic, loud sound, but it was also the songwriting was very imperfect.
Right.
Which is something that you either find distracting or you absolutely love. But then Zeppelin 2, which came out later that year, which is just crazy that the band could improve so much in 1 year. Because while Zeppelin 1's great, Zeppelin 2 is the perfected version of Zeppelin 1.
Yeah.
It takes all of the things that Zeppelin established, all the aspects of their sound that they established in 1, and they perfect them in 2.
Right.
And then they completely shift directions comes Zeppelin 3, which came out the following year in 1970. And Zeppelin 3 is this folksy sort of record.
Right.
And a lot of fans, I think, were taken aback by that.
It got a lot of criticism at the time. And that, I think, will go down in history as just one of those famous left turns that a band made that just immediately confused their fans. I mean, Kid A is another example. To a lesser extent, Weezer's Pinkerton.
Right.
A lot of people hated that when it came out because it was like, what is this band doing?
I still hate that album.
I know. I'm determined to convert you someday.
I wouldn't
but
put it past you.
It probably won't happen. But Zeppelin 3, actually, to put this out there, it's my favorite Led Zeppelin record.
Really?
It absolutely is. And I mean, it's hard to pick, but for me, I just connect more with that folksy, emotional sound of theirs. Like, yeah, I love Zeppelin when they're rocking the hell out, but, like Whole Lot of Love, hard track to beat, right? And I feel like that song is very much an epitome of their just hauling ass hard rocking attitude. But man, Zeppelin 3 just strikes such an emotional chord with tracks like Friends, That's the Way, even like Brawny R, Brawny R Stomp rather, which is, just kind of a fun, makes you want to move your hips and your shoulders, dance along kind of track. But it just has this mood and this variety that I just don't feel like they really captured anywhere else on their discography, because they're still not, eschewing their rock sound. They still have Immigrant Song. They still have Out on the Tiles. And then there's, the 7+ minute Since I've Been Loving You,
which is a fantastic bluesy track.
Right, which is just like, you know what? We're going to get our sleazy blues out of the way on this just one killer track, and they nail it. So for me, the variety on that record, what they accomplish in such a short amount of time is just extraordinary to me. But to me, that's what really set them apart. And I mentioned earlier, they're masters of their instruments. Each one of them, are at the top of their game. And I just don't think that's something you could say about the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. You can argue songwriting chops all day if you want, and I think that they're all, pretty close to the same level. But, I think of George Harrison as a guitar god, but I don't think of John Lennon as one. I don't think of Ringo Starr as a drum god. He's great. I would defend him till the day I die, because I think that he gets a lot of flack for the simplicity, but I think it was necessary. But then on the Rolling Stones side, I mean, it felt a lot of the time like the Jagger Richards show. They were at the forefront of the sound and the songwriting, and not that their bass player, their drummer were bad, but they didn't really take the limelight. I feel like Led Zeppelin did a great job of allowing everyone to take center stage when it was appropriate, and that balance between each component of the music was just phenomenal, especially while still being able to achieve such genre diversity.
One of the things you just brought up reminded me that I have to go off on a tangent here, because you're talking about Ringo Starr and how he doesn't get a fair shake. And one of the things that I think that he did so well that he just does not get the credit for is he made a wonderful narrator for Thomas the Tank. And my son just absolutely loves Thomas the Tank Engine. And I got to say, of all of the narrators, there was just surprising, like George Carlin and Alec Baldwin. Of all the narrators of Thomas the Tank Engine, Ringo Starr is by far the best. And he gets overlooked.
And that will forever be an edge that the Beatles has to Led Zeppelin.
Forever.
Because Jimmy Page just simply never was the conductor on Thomas the Tank Engine. What they missed an opportunity there.
They really did.
It was just an awful oversight.
We'll be writing him a memo, I'm sure.
Right.
So the following year, in 1971, Led Zeppelin came out with Four, which has gone down in history as one of the greatest albums, if not in contender for greatest album ever written. And I know that's a pretty big assertion.
Yeah,
I'm going there.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the reason is, of course, Stairway to Heaven, the quintessential heavy rock track of the 1970s. However, if you listen, there's 8 tracks on this record. If you listen to this record straight through, every single track on this record
killer.
Is legendary.
Yeah.
Is legendary. And it is, I have to say, it's my favorite record Zeppelin ever did. And I don't know if I'll ever change that opinion. No, certainly 3 and Houses of the Holy, the follow-up to 4, I like very much. But 4 just is a tier above that record.
Yeah. And that's totally understandable. And it's one of those things where, once again, I mean, I can disagree with you all day on just what our favorites are, but I would never fault someone for picking, Led Zeppelin 4 as their favorite. And I think that most people do. I think the reason that it's a close second for me. The reason it doesn't top 3 for me is that while each track is killer, I've never felt that it has that fluidity. They're like, yeah, let's make 8 of the greatest tracks ever written and just throw them on this record.
And isn't it interesting that I would gravitate more to that record when I'm so passionate about that album?
The album listen. Yeah, that is very interesting, but it just speaks to the songwriting quality. You can't deny it.
For sure. Admittedly, this was the record that my dad put on and
Sure.
said, you must listen to this. He bought it for me and said, you must listen to this. And I just ran with it. 9-year-old Jake thought this was the greatest thing that ever happened.
Well, growing up, I remember as a kid, my favorite Led Zeppelin song was the Battle of Evermore. Which then, I know it's from Zeppelin 4, but it speaks to why I like Zeppelin 3 so much stylistically. But it also, and its placement in Zeppelin 4 is just perfect, because I do feel like you get this just barrage of kind of rockin' tracks, and then it just slows down with that, and it's, it's gorgeous. It really is.
I guess the way that the album is structured, with Black Dog and Rock and Roll and then the Battle of Evermore and Stairway to Heaven, it does kind of break down, and then Stairway to Heaven builds back up, and then it goes back into a more like medium range rock.
And in that, you make a good case for it. It is a little bit more of a fluid album than I'm probably giving it credit for, but part of that too is that. And actually, maybe this goes in favor of it, and this is actually probably more of a good thing. So I'm probably proving myself wrong by making this point.
I'm going to win you over, Tom. I'll trade you Pinkerton for Zeppelin 4. I don't think that's a fair trade.
I don't know how that transaction actually occurs.
Music bucks. We'll figure out a way.
Right. But I think that actually part of the reason I think of it as being more of a collection of songs and a fluid listen is just because each track is a standout. And I will say about Zeppelin 3, there are a few tracks in there that I think help the flow of the album, but maybe aren't quite as strong on their own. And actually, I've always felt like Zeppelin 3 doesn't have the strongest closer, with hats off to Roy Harper.
That's true.
It's a little more kind of out there, it feels more like a sound experiment to me, but at the same time, I've always appreciated it because it's more of a come down.
Well, and that album never took itself as seriously as any of the rest of the Zeppelin's discography.
That's very true as well. You know what song I've really never gotten into of theirs? On Zeppelin 2, the track "Thank You."
Yeah,
that never has done anything for me.
I'm with you.
A guy I play music with, he plays bass in a band that I play with. He loves that song, and he does a cover of it. He can play it on acoustic guitar and sing it, and it's great. And I'm like, I just would never pick that track to learn and devote time to. To me, it's one that I don't know. Maybe I'll warm up to it someday. And I love Zeppelin 2. It's tough to say whether that's my favorite after 3 and 4, either that or Houses of the Holy for me.
That's a great segue, because Houses of the Holy really saw the band evolve into a different sound. It's the truly experimental Zeppelin record.
Right.
It still takes that Zeppelin 4 format of I think there's only like 8 tracks on it too, right?
Yeah.
9?
No, there's 8 on Houses of the Holy.
8 on Houses of the Holy. I told you, he knows everything about music. And those 8 tracks are just much more experimental sounding.
Yeah.
They're much more spastic, and there's a lot of dynamic contrast and a lot of intensity and a lot of new styles that you haven't seen Zeppelin play with to date.
Well, on Houses of the Holy, I think what's important is that they find a way to work that low dynamic in to the album, but without just switching to acoustic.
Right.
Because that's really how they brought it down, I feel like, on their first 3 records, is by saying, let's have a more acoustic track.
Right.
But Houses of the Holy, its low dynamic points are songs like No Quarter, and No Quarter is just this great psychedelic. It's even got this, that sleazy guitar line. It does build up a little bit, but it's just that, John Paul Jones on the keys. And it creates a mood. Now, of course, there still is like Rain Song and Over the Hills and Far Away, and those do have the acoustic. a bit more prominently. But
certainly in Over the Hills and Far Away.
Right. But you'll know Over the Hills and Far Away isn't really a down-tempo song. It's not really a ballad. It's more upbeat. It's more, along the lines of like
it rocks
Gallows
the hell out.
Pole,
It rocks the hell
in
out.
the beginning. But then it rocks out by the end. And so that album, it's more, they were finding ways to work those subtle low moments into a song without just forcing a song to be entirely low dynamic. And that's, I think, kind of an interesting distinction. One point I want to make, and this is a fun fact, and I probably told you this story before, but I read somewhere that this just blew me away, and I think that it says something about Led Zeppelin beyond just the extent of this individual story. But, I've always thought it was funny that they have the track Houses of the Holy on their next album, Physical Graffiti, but they still called their album Houses of the Holy, Houses of the Holy. Well, why didn't they put the title track on there? Well, what I read was that they decided it sounded too similar to the track Dancing Days, and they thought the Dancing Days fit their vision of that album better, so they included it on that album, but still liked the track Houses of the Holy and saved it for later. And that, to me, it says so much about the thought that they put in not only to their songs, but to their album construction.
It shows that they were craftsmen.
Right, exactly. They were not willing to make an 8-track album where things overlapped, where there was redundancy. They weren't willing to tread the same tracks. And that, to me, is just incredible. But they still called the album the same thing. They didn't change the way they were going to present it to the world. And I think that those kinds of decisions is really what makes them go down in history as just being one of the best. Because I think too many other bands would have compromised and would have sacrificed what their vision for an album was based on those things. And they would not do that.
That's true. So Physical Graffiti, 1975,
Yes.
double record. I would say a gut-wrenching shift in sound.
Yes.
Just almost just dirty and slightly sludgy sounding, especially in the guitars, all over this record. And the back half got even more experimental and a little bit more B-sidey, but it is a double record.
Yeah.
And I do feel like Physical Graffiti is still an incredibly high quality album from a songwriting perspective. But still, it's such an impactful listen just because it's constantly rocking you out. It's constantly pounding you in the face with just almost a sound that just is naturally frictioned.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, probably one of my least favorite Zeppelin albums.
No kidding.
Yeah. I've never been big into Physical Graffiti. I know, and I know going into this conversation that you like that album more than I do. I just know it. And trust me, I've given it fair due. I know the album well. It's not one that I gravitate to a lot.
Of their first 6, I would put 1, 2, and Physical Graffiti on the same tier.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And then 3 in Houses on the tier above, 4 on the top
4
tier.
as the king upon its throne. No, that's understandable. And I know that actually I'm kind of in the minority because I know a lot of people are really into Physical Graffiti. And for me, it's one of those things that I respect its sound and its approach.
It's raw intensity.
Right. But, and I mean, I love some of the tracks. I love, like I said, Houses of the Holy, and I love, Custard Pie. And I mean, the album is just, I don't know, for me, it doesn't capture that intensity quite as well as their earlier stuff. I feel like it as a double album, and this is gonna sound like heresy, I know it is, but it takes longer to accomplish what they already had accomplished on their first 5 albums.
I'd say that's a fair criticism.
And okay, good, because I thought you were going to punch me in the face.
I disagree, and I've been glaring at you as we sit here and record
Right.
this. I disagree, but I do feel like that's a fair criticism.
But you can't deny tracks like, Kashmir.
Oh,
I mean,
for sure.
Come on.
And how influential that track has been for all of music and hard rock and really metal in general.
Oh, yeah.
I could certainly see bands like Metallica being heavily influenced by tracks like Kashmir. But more so than anything else, I think Physical Graffiti represented that Led Zeppelin was changing.
Yeah.
That they were no longer that band that very quickly took over the rock and roll music industry in the late 60s and early 70s.
Right.
That they were changing into something that was going to be different, and change is hard for anyone to accept. Human beings just do not do well with change.
Right, but what else were they going to do at that point? Make Whole Lot of Love over and over again?
Exactly.
I think that Led Zeppelin 2 is a fantastic album, but if they had just made another album in that same vein, then it would have gotten old. It's just would have. And bands like that, they have to run their course and make their impact. And I think that's exactly what Led Zeppelin did. So, moving on from Physical Graffiti with albums like Presence and In Through the Outdoor. And I still like both of those albums. I think that they are a little bit underrated just because they don't live up to, what Led Zeppelin had already established quite as strongly.
The critical acclaim and the fan love for the first 6 records.
Right. But you think about, if Presence or In Through the Outdoor had been put out by some other band, it would have been probably that band's best album. They're still great records. And I actually have one friend who I think Presence is his favorite album of theirs. Yeah. And he always comes back to the track T for One and defends that as saying, you listen to that track and it's like an encapsulation and representation of everything that Led Zeppelin had accomplished in like one track. But the thing for me is I feel like at that point in their career, I just don't feel like Robert Plant's voice was holding up as well.
Sure.
Things started to sound a little bit different. It wasn't just in their songwriting, it was in some of the performance aspects. But there's still a lot of great highlights from that point. In Through the Outdoor had some also. Fool in the Rain is a great song. It's just, while that's a great song, it's not great at the level that songs like Black Dog and Stairway to Heaven and Immigrant Song were. It's like, yeah, this is good to listen to, but, it's just, they had already done so much great stuff up to that point.
And that was their last album of fully original material.
Before John Bonham's passing.
Right. So what impact, Tom, would you say Led Zeppelin played on music going forward, and where are they at today in musical canon?
Well, they're up there. I would put as kind of some of the most critically acclaimed bands of all time. They're up there. To me, it's Beatles, Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin. Maybe the Who, and I don't know. I'm sure I could think of some more, but
as far as rock and roll is
right,
concerned.
As far as rock and roll is concerned, but I think that they're up there. I think the big impact that they had to me is that they really were able to take what had been already kind of flirted with in terms of taking blues and even some aspects of country and really repackaging it into hard rock, into what could not be called anything else but hard rock. And maybe on a track-by-track basis, you listen to some of their stuff and Friends and Gallows Pole are not hard rock songs. Not at all.
Folk.
Right. But you look at the broader spectrum of what they did as a band, and they had so many hard rocking moments. But actually, more than anything, what I think it's about than the actual style of their playing is just their attitude towards it.
Sure.
They were uncompromising. They were willing to experiment and venture into new sounds. And they just, even just their image, when it just comes down to their image, they were like the rock and roll band of the time. And they summed it up so well, took so many genres, made them work for themselves. It was kind of just a display of power. Like, yeah, we'll do whatever we want and it will be good. And I think that attitude really reflected on bands that were then inspired by them, but maybe just realized, yeah, we can't quite do everything Led Zeppelin did because really who can, but we'll focus on little pieces of it. Bands like Van Halen and, I don't know why that's the first one that comes to mind, but it's like, tell me that bands like Van Halen, hard rock bands for the rest of the 70s and the 80s weren't influenced by Led Zeppelin. It's just that they took one part of their sound and really focused on it a bit more.
Sure. And no one can say baby that many times in a song and get away with it
right.
nowadays. No one else can pull it off.
No, Justin Bieber tried.
He tried.
But
he failed.
Right.
At everything he does.
Right.
Would you say that Led Zeppelin today, their music has stood the test of time and will continue to stand the test of time and is still as fresh as anything that's coming out today?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a big part of that is just commitment to mastery of what they were doing as a band and at the level of each instrumentalist. I just think that's a dedication and a kind of perseverance, or maybe even obsession, that a lot of people don't really strive for anymore. And because of that, I mean, people hear that and people respond to it. I think it's something that someone could do again, but just so much has changed in the world that I don't know if it ever will happen.
Fair. As we close up here, what's your favorite Zeppelin song?
I think Friends from
Really?
Zeppelin 3. A very atypical pick, but that song it's just gorgeous to me. Like, I like a lot of stuff like that of theirs, but that's why I love that there's two sides of the Zeppelin coin, something there for everyone.
For me, I don't know if I can actually pick a track.
Yeah.
If you held a gun to my head, I'd probably say Over the Hills and Far Away.
Nice. That's a good pick.
If not that, then When the Levee Breaks.
Oh,
I was listening to When the
drum
Levee
sound.
Breaks.
the drum sound.
Funny story about that. So Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans on my first day of college in 2005. And I remember driving down to the college I was going to at the time with a couple friends, and we blared When the Levee Breaks right as Katrina was hitting New Orleans, and I thought that was just that moment has stuck in my mind, and I will forever love that song for that one very impactful moment in my life.
Right.
So that being said, Zeppelin is one of those bands I will continue to come back to.
Oh, same here.
At least once a week for the rest of my life, I'm sure.
And I'm sure we could find, we could talk about them for another 2 hours if we wanted to, but, trying to keep this a bit more concise. But, if you haven't listened to Led Zeppelin, go check them out. And even take the time to check out some of their stuff that maybe you're not as familiar with, because you'll probably find some gems that you are surprised by.
I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
This is that podcast the guys from Velocities and Music are trying out. We don't really know what this is yet, but it's going to be a thing. Thanks for listening.